You guys must be blessed. I finished my PowerPoint ahead of time. You must be very lucky. Whew.
We feel very lucky. Senor, before you get started, real quick, Travis, was there anything you needed to go over before we let Senor get started?
Again, Håfa day, everybody. Just really quickly, just some ground, some like housekeeping things. I was notified that some folks didn't have or weren't able to access the recordings or the videos once it was posted. They didn't receive the email. So if that did happen to you, if you could please just private message me at the end, or like, I'm sorry, if you could just private message me, and then I can send those, I can direct you to them, and then I'll see where the error popped up. But yeah, Sidzus Mossy.
And then the only other thing is anyone that hasn't registered on the team app with Maga'lahi Para Agupa so that you can receive the notifications. I'll go ahead and post it into the chat, but go ahead and request access to that site. That way you will automatically get the notifications every time we upload the videos. And then you can also forward that link to other people for them to be able to see it as well. I think that should be it. So, Senor, it is all you now. You're on mute, Senor.
Oh, no, hold on. I was just testing to make sure that mute works. Just kidding. But last class was lots of fun to go through, talking sort of about Fu'una, and sort of then talking about sort of not just Fu'una herself, but how then that translates in terms of values, cultural sort of energy, cultural sort of even sort of a spirit and essence sort of moving ahead in time after that. And so today we're going to jump ahead into the Spanish period, the very early days of the Spanish period. And the second figure that we're going to talk about in this, can I share? Can I share, Hungen?
Hungen, Travis, you should be able to give him sharing rights. Okay.
Ooh, I'm the host now. Okay, you guys.
You're the host
something
now.
Completely different now. Now that I'm in, no, I'm just kidding. We're all going to Vegas, virtual Vegas. We're all going to gamble. Just kidding. All right. And so who we're going to talk about as our second figure is Agualin. And so Hurao gets a lot of attention in terms of this period. Kepuha gets even more attention for different reasons. But Agualin is the most interesting, in my opinion. And there are some people who some historians who say that Agualin may just be Hurao, but the Spanish priests couldn't tell the difference between Chamorros. It's a possibility. There are some who argue that actually Agualin's speech, which we'll talk about today, is just derived from Hurao's speech. It's a possibility. But there's enough evidence to show that Agualin was his own distinct person, because of, there is a date at which the Spanish announced that Hurao dies, sort of circumstances around his death. But Agualin is somebody who continues to fight even after Hurao has died, and fights in a completely different way. His approach is a little bit different than Hurao's. And so I'm glad that we can talk about him, because he was, in some ways, even though other figures get more attention, Hurao, Kepuha, Matapang, he was the figure which even one Guam historian argues was sort of the supreme example of Chamorro resistance and intelligence at this time. He was somebody who fought fiercely and used every intellectual weapon at his disposal in order to try to defeat the Spanish. And so these dates, these years are important. The first 30 years of the Spanish presence in the Marianas are filled with a lot of sporadic fighting. And the fighting becomes very significant in Hagatna in these 3 years, each time because a different leader organizes sometimes thousands, sometimes hundreds, sometimes dozens of warriors to attack Hagatnya. Now, there's other fighting that happens, and a lot of the stuff that happens has never even really been written about. They're in firsthand accounts that have never been put forth into any narrative form. But for example, one of the big victories that the Spanish felt that they had was over the people of Hanum in Injigo, the last sort of organized resistance in Guam in the 1670s, or a village that many of you may have never even heard of, Pipuk, which is where Talafofo Bay is, that when the Spanish defeated them, victory to have defeated that village. But almost nothing is written about these sorts of these battles, these exchanges. And so, but these are the three sort of key moments. And one reason why historians tell the history in this way is because from the Lagobien history, and this is a history which was written by a French priest in Europe who never visited the Marianas, but looked at different letters and accounts from the priests who settled and who colonized the Marianas for the Spanish. And so he put together a history of the Marianas. And if you're a big history nerd, UOG Press recently republished it, The History of the Marianas, a new translation with notes, with extra notes and footnotes, adding in a little bit more context for it. It's a really great thing if you can afford it. But the Chamorro-Spanish Wars, this is, there's lows, there's peaks. The time period that we're talking about, though, is its most tragic and violent period. So this is after Sanvitoris dies. When Sanvitoris, the leader, the sort of the man who starts the mission, who was its moral compass, for better or worse, when he is killed by Matapang, it basically makes it so that the Spanish military gets to be in charge. And in the 1670s, Guam becomes, and the Marianas become, the most dangerous place in the entire world for priests, because Chamorros kill priests in very significant numbers, despite the smallness of the population. And so more and more soldiers flood in. And so Hurao, who faced a much smaller military force, is one thing, but by the time Agualin emerges to sort of fight his war of resistance, the Spanish are much more militarized. And by this time, villages have already been burnt down. The Spanish have already set about slaughtering Chamorros, publicly executing Chamorros, punishing Chamorros for the merest slight. There was a no tolerance, zero tolerance policy. And so this is the 1670s. And so some of you have heard this story before, but it is important because it is a story which Agualin would often mention as he was trying to get people riled up, to get Chamorros to take up arms, to resist the Spanish. The village of Oroti, this is Oroti Point, where US Navy base Guam is today. And on Oroti are the sites of several different ancient villages. Oroti was one of them, or Uloti as Chamorros most likely referred to it. Oroti had a church in it, and there was a priest there who was very worried that the people were turning against the Spanish. And the priest was so worried because one of the things that happened when the Chamorros tried to turn against, when they would start to turn against the Spanish, is that they would try to set the church on fire. And in fact, Agualin, one of the things that he was suspected of doing was organizing people in the village of Hilaan to burn the church down in their village. And so the priest there decided to try a bold strategy to try to sort of quell a lot of this discontent and try to bridge the divides between the Spanish, the church, and the Chamorro community. And so there was a woman there, a young Chamorro woman, who is called Dikiki in the legend of this story. We don't actually know what her name was, but in the legend of the story, she was called Dikiki. And she was a Christian Chamorro, and she was fervent in her faith. In fact, she was fervent and passionate about the new religion, even when her family wasn't. And so the priest asked Dikiki, would she be willing to sacrifice something very important and very special in order to help the cause of God in her savage land? And Dikiki, who was super faithful and loyal to the church, said, Hungan, absolutely, Padre. Whatever the Spanish need from me, I'm down. And so the priest said, I want you to get married to a Spanish officer. I feel that if you two who share the same faith but come from different races, if you are united, the people will see that we are not so different and that our faith and our love in God can connect us despite our pasts. And so Dikiki agreed. Her family was very upset, and her father confronted the priest. The account says that he attacked the priest, but the priest was not harmed, which means he probably yelled at the priest. He probably said, hey, Havena Sosuma, what you doing? Huh? Avesti? He probably got really mad, went all full metal chod like that on him. But this was a time when you didn't do anything like that to the Spanish. Even if for an Atan Baba, you might find yourself beaten and on the ground. And so the Spanish governor at that time sent soldiers down to Uroti. They arrested the father of Dikiki, and they brought him to Hagatnya, where the governor gathered everybody from the village, and they hung him as punishment and to make an example of those who go against the Spanish. And even to make this much, much worse and much, much more tragic, somebody dies, it's already bad enough, but punishing somebody for the simple fact of trying to defend the family of his honor, trying to defend the honor of his family, it's a big thing. It was a huge offense what they did to Dikiki's father, but it was made even worse by how they treated his body afterwards. The father's body was cut down and it was dragged to the orphanage that the priests had. By this time, there was already a lot of war orphans. So these were children whose parents had been killed by the Spanish and who had no one to raise them. And so the priests eagerly snatched up those children and raised them in their orphanage, wanting to raise them right. And these children were oftentimes sycophants. They were sort of mindlessly loyal to the church, mindlessly loyal to the priests and whatever the priests told them. And so the body of the dead Chamorro man was presented to the children. And the children at first were like, ew, kalakasano, that's gross. But the priests and the governor told them, this is now your pet. This is now your toy. And so the children dragged the body of this dead man around Hagatnya. And the priests taught the children a song about how, as a song that they sang gleefully as they dragged this dead body around, warning everybody who listened that those who don't accept God will die, just like this dog. And so this is an important story in Agualin's story, because one of the things, I'll get to that in a second. So the treatment of Dikiki's family by the Spanish enraged people in Uroti. And so the governor, realizing that things were turning, that there was probably no chance to save the church in Uroti, knowing that the people of Uroti were up in arms against the Spanish, sent soldiers down to the village to try to save the church and save the priest. By the time the soldiers got there, the Chamorros were angry. And they were already brandishing spears and bone knives against the Spanish soldiers, already throwing sling stones at them to chase them away, or worse yet, to fight them. And so the soldiers abandoned the church. And they started to chase the Spanish, chase them back north. And by the time the Spanish, as they moved across the peninsula, and by the time they reached the village of Sumai, they found that a lot of the other villages in the area had gathered spears to fight against them as well. And so their escape back to Hagatnya through Pidi was cut off. And then forces from Agate, because Agate is always down to fight. We know this from ancient times. Agate is always down to fight. They had joined as well. And so the Spanish soldiers and priests were stuck in Sumai. They quickly seized a Lati house and moved inside it to protect themselves from the sling stones and the spears being thrown at them. The priest and the soldiers were worried. There was no way to get notice to the governor about the state that they were in. And they couldn't hide safely in a Lati house because eventually Chamorros would probably light spears on fire and try to set the roof aflame or try to smoke them out. They appeared to be saved, however, when they heard a voice booming across the village. It was a Maga'lahi from the village of Hagatnya, whose name was Chelef, or as the Spanish write his name, Cheref. And he cried out, and the histories record his speech. I don't know why you show yourself so cruel toward people so good as the Spanish are. They have never done any harm to anyone unless they have been harmed first. And even after they have received it from many of our people, whenever we have wanted to reconcile with them, they have admitted us to their friendship. And this they have never broken with us. And if they have had wars with us, they have been much provoked. Besides this, what kind of courage is this? So many wanting to fight so few. In one word, if you insist on pursuing those who are fleeing, this is not courage. You would only serve to make others angry who are in the garrison and ridicule us and make the governor angry. Chelef then gathered up 2 or 3 spears and hurled them at the Chamorros who were gathered. And so Chelef comes from Hagatnya to defend the priest and defend the Spanish, calling out the courage and the bravery of those who have gathered with so many against so few who are trying to flee. And he is able to chase away those that have gathered. He then tells the priest after the Chamorros have disappeared that he had come after hearing about their misfortune, and that he would then look for a canoe that could take them back to Hagatnya. And so Tela found a canoe. He gathered all of the soldiers and the priest into the canoe, and then he started to head north back to Hagatnya where they would be safe. But the interesting thing about Chelef, though, is that been waiting for sort of the right moment in order to reveal who he really was. And that moment came once they were in deeper water, when he capsized his canoe, and all of the soldiers and the priests who were in it were dropped into the water. And the Spanish soldiers oftentimes found that while their armor helped them on the land and their guns helped them on the land, once they got wet or once they were in the water, they were useless. And so Chelef swam away just as all of the Chamorros that he had just a little time before been admonishing and chasing away appeared from the jungle on the edge of the beach. And they all descended into the water and then killed all of the soldiers and the priest. Chelef, double agent Chelef, I like that. So this story is important because Agualin, what made Agualin an exceptional leader was his ability to speak, and then eventually, and his ability to plan and to strategize. And so Agualin started to speak passionately in the same way that Hurao had. But one thing that's different is that Hurao's speech is a very sort of esoteric philosophical speech. It mentions a few things that Chamorros were upset about, but it is largely focused on this thing called liberty, freedom, which every culture understands differently. But some historians have argued that Hurao's speech is probably fake because, or probably contrived at least, because it speaks about human liberty and freedom in a way that Chamorros might not have understood it or spoken about it at that time. Agualin's speech is different. Agualin's speech is much longer, interestingly enough, but his speech is focused on connecting the everyday injustices and atrocities, the everyday affronts, the everyday forms of disrespect that Chamorro's experienced, channeling that into narratives which would incite the people to rebel and seek to regain the comfort of their culture, seek to protect sort of the comforting nostalgia, the comforting embrace of their practices, of their rituals, of their families. That it wasn't that the Spanish were attacking these lofty principles, but that the Spanish were keeping you from the daily things that you needed to do to survive. That the Spanish were keeping you from doing all of the things that you love to do in your life. And so that's why, as I said, Agualin's speech is quite long, but here are some examples of the things that he talks about. He says, they teach our children their own way so that they would rather disobey their parents than disobey anything their teachers tell them. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that if you're praying to your, or excuse me, if you're giving reverence to the skull of your ancestors and then your child says, that's not grandpa, that's just a skull. Polly says that's a skull, that's not real. Polly says that's the demon that you're doing. And what would you do? I think I would break my kid's ear or something like that. I would like lick that thing into oblivion. Oh my goodness. But so, and then he mentions the sort of atrocity about the way that Dikiki's father was treated. A short time ago, these boys dragged the body of one of our relatives because he had not wanted to become a Christian when they killed him. They did this just to please their teachers, referencing that fact. And that's something that everybody, even if you didn't want to fight against the Spanish, that was something that would shock your core. If you hadn't accepted the new religion faithfully and wholeheartedly, to see young children gleefully treat a body with such disrespect. And remember that if you've taken a previous class with me, if you've studied Guam history, the treatment of a body after death determines what happens to the spirit. So to mutilate a body, to drag it around like that, to mock it, to use it in such a disrespectful, terrible, immoral way would mean that the soul might be tormented. The soul might not remember the love of the family, might not remember the line of the people. And so it might become an evil, malicious spirit because of that. And so they teach us if we are wiser than them. And then he mentions stuff, impose our laws. He says marriage, right? That you have to be with only one woman and no more, and that we have to put up with her until she dies. And so this would go both ways, actually. So the priest would also tell a woman that she has to be with one man and she's supposed to put up with him until he dies. And he's got to do whatever, she has to do whatever he says too. Ouch. They want us to spend the holidays in church and not to work in our properties and do other bothersome things. And so other things in his speech that Agualin mentions, for example, are the ulitao, that sort of, they have attacked the ulitao so that you cannot engage, so that the houses of learning and the social houses for the youth, the young men and women, are being burnt. And that's an attack on the culture. Also mentioned when we need to prepare for the fishing season, they make us sit on our knees, sit in church on our knees instead. And so this was Agualin's power, is to sort of talk about all these things which Chamorros had accepted. This is who we are, this is part of our life. And then say the Spanish have taken this from you. The Spanish don't allow you to enjoy these simple pleasures. But Agualin was also very hardcore. His rhetoric was very powerful. And so in his speech, he also says, "Mga man maatnyaw nusiha, do not be afraid of them. Men megahits and men dididihat siha, we are many and they are few. Ikubadeta nusiha, man fan matatnya, man manafan matatnya siha." Our fear only makes them brave. Wahu by hudirihi hamzu mo nagilan saku, ni megay pinino niya sa parupuno siya todo. shall lead you with my lance, which has killed many, and will kill them all. Ooh, I want to sign up with Agualin right now. Actually, that definitely, whatever sort of masculinity is in me was definitely appealed to by that. And so he also his rhetoric combined these two things. The Spanish noted that Agualin was silver-tongued. They compared him to the devil, and not the devil just in terms of being negative and horrible and bad, but the devil in terms of like the devil who can make you do things, who can whisper, that that sort of all the work that the priests might do in a year, Agualin could undo it, sort of in a simple speech to those same people. And so now Agualin attacks Hagåtña. Now the attack by Agualin on Hagåtña is difficult in certain ways because different accounts said it at different times, and the accounts describe it in different ways. It was not a single attack. So one thing about Agualin that was different from Hurao is that Hurao's forces had gathered for one big attack and then eventually had returned again after the first attack stalled. But it was a huge, massive force. Agualin never gathered as large a force as Hurao's coalition. One priest says that about 500 people followed Agualin. And so this, because in the time of Agualin, things are not as simple under Hurao. Under Hurao, many Chamorros were against the Spanish, and there was few who were very fervently loyal to the Spanish. There were some, but most villages were over the Spanish, over the new religion. They didn't necessarily want it. But what happens in the 1670s, what happens in the time of Agualin, is that the villages are starting to get divided in their loyalty for and against the Spanish. So what we find, for example, is that villages such as Uroti, Haget, Sumay, they are against the Spanish. And then other villages in that area like Fena, Tilisay. Villages in the south, interestingly enough at that time, some of them, such as Umatic, in Arahan, Malesu, they might be for the Spanish. And so the loyalties were always shifting. And this eventually led to conflicts not against the Spanish, but conflicts between the villages themselves. And so in the south, for example, the villages of Ati and Sidza, which are right next to each other and are today Seribe and Salabe, these were two villages which were on different sides of the Chamorro-Spanish Wars. Ati was against the Spanish and had even gone so far as warriors from that village had killed a priest and tried to kill the Spanish governor. Sidza was for the Spanish and was mentioned last class. The priests note that the Maga'lahi from there was so passionate about her loyalty to the church and to the new religion and to God that she organized her men to gain favor with the Spanish by killing rebel Chamorros and presenting their bodies to the Spanish. And so Agualin couldn't ever get the entire island on one side of this, because by that time there was already Chamorros who had signed up for the Spanish. And in fact, I realize now I forgot to make one slide. There was one slide that I wanted to include here, which is for one of the key Chamorros who there was 3 Chamorros that the Spanish noted that saved them. Now, some of the priests mentioned it more than like the government or anything like that, but they did officially give all 3 of these men titles, and they gave them ranks in the sort of the first Guam Chamorro militia. And so these were men who had sided with the Spanish and who had fought the Spanish and who by the end of the wars had killed many on behalf of the Spanish. One of them at this time, the opposite to Agualin, sort of his opposition, was Antonio Ayihi. And so it was Antonio Ayihi who had signed up early with the Spanish, and not just himself, but his entire extended family. And making those meetings, and they were the spy network. So many of the things that appear in early letters from the priests come from Aihi's family, because they were secretly infiltrating all of the rebel Chamorro meetings that they could find to listen in on who was against the Spanish and then report back to the priests. And so the governor and the priests at this time, in opposition to Agualin, were trying to offer Aihi as the true leader of the Chamorro people. And some villages decided to give him their turtle shell and to give him their spears. And so this is why Agualin couldn't ever fight the Spanish with a force as large. But rather than wait for everybody to be on his side, right? Because sometimes people feel like you have to wait till everyone's on your side or everyone's united. Agualin realized that they needed to attack now and soon, recognizing that the Spanish were always bringing in more weapons and more soldiers into the island. So Agualin's attack on Hagåtña comes in multiple waves over several months. And so the first attack begins with an attack on Hagåtña itself, on the land. And so there is sort of a compound area in which there is the church, there are the barracks, and there's all of these different buildings. Agualin's forces attack. The Spanish had been anticipating this, though, because of rumors and whispers. You can't really keep a secret like that on Guam Nai, and this is before WhatsApp. So you can't really keep it a secret. And so the Spanish, so when Agualin realizes that they don't necessarily have the power or the will or the weapons to actually defeat the Spanish once they're bunkered in, they decide to blockade. And so they blockade Hagåtña. Now, the captain of the forces decides to try to break the blockade. They rush out and they do so, but Agualin decides to reorganize and returns a few weeks later. But when he returns, he comes with a dual prong assault, where his men attack on the land, but at the same time, his men also attack in canoes from the ocean. And so they push the Spanish back into sort of the church in Hagåtña. And so they decide to blockade them and hold them there, trying to starve them out, not letting anyone into Hagåtña at all to give them food or to give them aid. And so this attack by Agualin, interestingly enough, it does seem like the Spanish are done for. The Spanish become so desperate that at this time, what they do is they try to carve pieces. They put crossbows up on the barricades, which they don't actually have any bolts for, to try to convince Chamorros that they've got all these defenders everywhere. They carve like sticks and make them look like muskets to try to pretend that they have more muskets than they actually do. And Chamorros now, when they go up to the barricades to try to set them on fire or to taunt the Spanish, they have shields that they use in case they get hit, in case to sort of muffle any musket fire towards them. Now, unfortunately, this plan by Agualin fails. And the priests, and sort of the accounts are written by priests who were totally excited about the governor's plan because it saved them and it saved the mission. But so knowing that they couldn't necessarily defeat the Chamorros outright, the governor at that time the Spanish governor, decided to come up with a plan to take advantage of what the priest said was sort of the Chamorro desire for competition and the Chamorro desire for means to prove them better than their fellow Chamorros. And so what the Spanish governor did is that there was an area on the beach outside the stockade. And so one day he went and he put, while the Chamorros in the canoes are sailing along the bay, patrolling it, he put a flag on the beach prominently where everybody could see it. And so the next day, I mean, if you can imagine what the guys in the canoes are talking about, because one day a flag appears there or something like that, and on one of the canoes, these guys from one village are like, "Hey, you see that flag? Bet you I could get that flag. Whatever. You're like the slowest dogging in the village, Jumbie. You could never get that flag. And I bet you I'm fast. I mean, I'm fast, faster than you. The only person who says you're fast is your wife. And then, so they're going, and then another canoe sails by and says, hey, are you guys talking about that flag? Before you could even talk about it, we would already get it because we're the fastest village on this island. And then another canoe comes by and says, hey, we're going to go get it right now. You know what we're going to get to? We're going to get your sister. And so you've got all of these guys on these canoes who start to talk about that flag and see it as this contest to see who is the bravest, who could be the fastest. And so one day, a bunch of those canoes suddenly start to sail in, trying to outpace each other. The beach, though, and as warriors start to run towards the flag, the Spanish were waiting for this. And they have cannon and they have muskets ready. And they aim the cannon, they hit the warriors that are running, and they aim the cannon at the canoes that have landed, destroying them and killing many. And this is what breaks Agualin's coalition spirit. Once news reaches the forces on the land about sort of the massacre that happened on the beach, people start to disappear, and sort of the siege of Hagåtña is over. But that wouldn't be the, tactics is misspelled there, tactax. And so this would not be the end of Agualin, though. What he eventually realized is that having sort of a large force would never sort of accomplish his means. And so for the next 5 years, for the next 3 years, he resorts to guerrilla tactics. And other resistance leaders by that time had also resorted to similar means, knowing that it was hard to defeat the Spanish in open battle. They resorted to, it's the Chamorro spelling, tactics. And so Matapang himself was also one of those two. After the Spanish had worked hard to try to capture him and even wounded him, he escaped them and then sort of also carried out different guerrilla tactics, aiding villages in Guam that still wanted to fight against the Spanish and still wanted to resist. But what slowly happens is that as the years go on in the 1670s, less and less people want to fight. The Spanish, the brutality had reached sort of horrible new levels. The Spanish had begun to publicly display mutilated bodies. And so, for example, one of the worst examples was when somebody who was accused of killing a soldier from the village of Tumon, because Tumon was burnt to the ground by this point. And because Tumon was filled with not just Matapang, but others who had challenged the Spanish, and that the people of Tumon had even laid a trap for the Spanish and killed a number of soldiers. Matapang had been the one to organize that trap. They had captured this person, and then they had tied him to 4 horses with different limbs, and they had quartered him. They had torn him to pieces. And then after that, they had placed his body parts on spikes, large pikes, and then they had put each of those body parts at a different entrance to the village of Tumon as a warning for the people. And so the Spanish had started to do this more and more. And in fact, by 1670, Guam actually had more villages that were pro-Spanish than anti-Spanish. Because by this point, the pro-Spanish villages were the ones doing the atrocities. And that it was neighbors turning on neighbors, it was villages turning on villages, and sometimes it was families turning against their own. And so if you wanted to gain favor with the Spanish, hunt down their enemies and bring the bodies or their heads to them, and they would reward you. And so this is why Luta becomes sort of the safe haven. Chamorros, so in the same way in which there's the legend of the boy who leaps to Rota in order to escape the wrath of his father, Chamorros seeking to flee the Spanish and sort of their terror and their oppression would head to Luta, and that was their sanctuary in the 1670s, because the Spanish had no means of getting safely to Luta. And they had Chamorros and they had faithful Christians, but they weren't to the point yet where they had organized them into their allies to help them fight. And so people such as Agualin, even Chelef, who had joined forces with Agualin, because one of the things that Agualin also did is that he told the great stories of those such as Matapeng and Chelef, who had fought the Spanish, who had defeated them. Because sometimes Chamorros would say that we can't defeat them, they're too powerful, their spirits are too strong. And then Agualin would remind them about Chelef, who by just using his mind, and his courage, had killed 7 or 8 soldiers and a priest. Or how Matapeng had killed a squad of Spanish soldiers doing nothing more than chopping down a couple trees. Because the trap that Matapeng had laid when the soldiers were trying to find him after he had killed Sanvitores was simple. There was a trail going to Tuman, and Matapeng and his men had cut down the trees blocking that trail, forcing the Spanish to try to walk to Tuman on the reef. And so instead of going sort of on the hospital point through Tamuning to Tuman, they had tried to go from like Alupeng. Had been waiting for that. And so as soon as they were at the halfway point, he attacked from Tuman and his allies attacked from the Alupeng side, and they killed all of the Spanish. And so Agualin used those stories to continue to stoke the courage and inspire the people to still stand up, even as the years dragged on and more were dying of disease and more were dying from treachery and from dying from just the violence of the Spanish. In 1680, Agualin is, that's the end of sort of the violent phase of the Chamorro-Spanish Wars in Guam. In Guam. By 1679, the last village on Guam, which was against the Spanish, was defeated, the village of Honum in the north. And with that, Guam was considered to be pacified. The year before that, a new commander, Don Jose Quiroga, had come into the Marianas. And he was different than previous other commanders. He was somebody who was a military man who had fought in battles in Europe for sure, but he was also somebody who fiercely believed in the mission of the Marianas, that they were to defeat the devil. This was different than a lot of the other soldiers and a lot of the other officers who, yeah, wanted to help the priests, sure, but really just wanted to stay alive and wanted to get home and didn't really give a crap about the larger mission. Quiroga was different. Quiroga seemed to believe. He was a believer. And so whereas many of the Spanish forces were just happy that Guam was no longer fighting them, Quiroga wanted to complete the mission. And because all of the Chamorros by 1680 who hated the Spanish and hated Christianity had fled to the north. They had fled to the northern islands where they could continue to live the way that they wanted. Quiroga was offended by that, and he wanted to finish the job. And so the first and most important place was the island of Rota, or Luta, which was the sanctuary for rebel Chamorros. And so Quiroga invaded Rota, defeated sort of the forces there. Agualin was captured. And Quiroga told the people of Rota, after he had executed a number of them for challenging the power of the Spanish, he said that if you are to, you are not to ever help the rebel Chamorros again. If you do so, I will come back. And so from that point on, Chamorros didn't have a safe haven into the way that they did before. So Agualin was taken back to Hagåtña, where he was executed by hanging. And a little while before that, even Selef, who had fought alongside Agualin, he was also executed. He was killed by the people of Maleso to gain favor by the Spanish. And that when the Spanish got his body, they cut off his hands. And then they strung up his hands. And then they displayed them outside of Hagåtña as a reminder not to go against the Spanish. And so one of the great quotes that I love about Agualin is when a priest says that he was eloquent in his barbarity. He was eloquent in his savagery. And I think that that's something sort of something that we should remember, even after the Chamorro-Spanish Wars are long over. I like that idea of eloquent in his barbarity. It reminds me of what the late congressman and civil rights pioneer John Lewis, what he was known for saying: good trouble. You should get into some good trouble. And so eloquent in his barbarity, for me, is a way of, it's a nice way of referring to sort of critical Chamorro narratives, sort of resistance, resistance not just in ancient times, but even up until today. That when you speak about something which is precious to us, which is important to us, people may think of it as just sort of crazy talk, barbaric language. But as long as we are eloquent in our barbarity, that's what really makes the difference. As long as we speak faithfully, truthfully, and intelligently in our quote unquote barbarity, that's what'll make the difference. NWA. And so, okay, woohoo! I wanted to do this in 40 minutes. Did it in like 46, Biba. Okay, so I do have to leave exactly at 12 o'clock today. So that's why I wanted to finish early, so that if there are any questions or any points of discussion. And so does anyone have? And unfortunately, there's not much in honor of Agualin nowadays. There's not much sort of that's out there about him. There's a few people that have his name nowadays. If you're familiar with the brand, the eco-friendly brand Misa, which makes like metal straws from Guam and other sort. One of the owners of it is Agualin, which is how the Spanish put down Agualin's name. Agualin Iriarte, son of Leonard Iriarte, the master chanter. And so there's a few people that have Agualin or Agualin's name nowadays. And there is a hut, a Festpac hut in Hagåtña as part of the Chamorro village that has Agualin's name. But not so much. So these stories all come from Spanish documents. And so some of them are there. So, I mean, some of like some of what I've told you, for example, you can just find in the book Destiny's Landfall by Robert Rogers, because that's pretty much for now the most comprehensive Guam history book. And so, so they wouldn't, so part of it is that these stories were the ones that were these aren't like stories. So some of them are reports, like official reports, but a lot of them just come from the priests that were writing letters, that were sort of taking down notes about what was happening. And so one thing to keep in mind is that for them, when like a bunch of atrocious things happened to Chamorros, if it was in the name of God, it was good. And so, yeah, so that's why they wrote it down. The church says that some of those things are made up, but it was priests who were saying them. It was priests who were writing them down. Now there are some who say that there are new translations of some of those documents, but still it doesn't sort of and some of them, like for example, there is a professor at the University of Guam, David Atienza, who wants to show that the Spanish weren't as brutal as sort of some of the history books say, and some of what he has pointed out is true. Like, for example, like Quiroga, for example, didn't slaughter everybody. He might execute some. And so in some early Guam history books, it would say that Quiroga would slaughtered everybody. But no, he would kill some for sure, execute some to make an example. So there are some who try to say that, but really it is just that these are the pieces that we get from the priests as they were writing home about what they were going through. And some of it may have just been them wanting to tell their families and their friends what was going on. Some of it, however, we have to keep in mind, some of it is tied to their own desire to become martyred and become saints and become known within the church. So the Marianas was dangerous. It was the most dangerous place in the Catholic world during this time. And so you wanted to write back these stories about what was going on, because if you died in the service of God, these stories would be important in talking about how you risked everything for him, how you gave your life for him. But that's part of the frustration, right? Is that they don't tell us the things that we might want to know, right? They just tell us the things that affect them. So that's why it's always like this with these types of stories, is that the priests will tell you all of these things, and then they'll mention one thing, and that one thing they mention is more interesting than all the other stuff that they've mentioned. It's like when you watch a movie and they mention something like, oh yeah, I went on a mission and did this, and you're like, whoa, that sounds way more interesting than what's actually happening right now in the movie. I wish I was watching that movie right now. That's the way it is with a lot of these accounts. At what point so there's definitely there's no genocide that necessarily takes place. There's always thousands of Chamorros. The lowest that it gets is to around 1,500. 1,500 people in the mid 1700s, and it was probably a little bit more than that actually. And then there's never any large migration of non-Chamorros to Guam during the Spanish period. So people would come from the Philippines and the Americas, and some from Spain, to work for the Spanish government and as soldiers, and some of them would stay. But it was never this mass migration. So that's why any idea that sort of Chamorros cease to exist genetically, not necessarily true. I mean, Chamorros are mixed because everybody's got somebody else in their heritage. But this was something which was put forth as a historical narrative, even though it's not really true. That idea that all the men died and then all of these outsiders came and married a women, that never happened. If you look at the population statistics for the 1700s, it's about the same. There's no it's not like there was 1,200 women and just 300 men left. It's about equal. And so part of the idea about sort of that the Chamorro people are lost and then we just become this mestiza people, it's mainly just because that's and so it's just because compared to their ancient ancestors. But the people of Rhoda, and there's supposed to be a meeting this week with a National Geographic researcher, Miguel Villar, where he's supposed to update us on his genetic project for Chamorros, because the people of Rhoda barely had any outside influence for hundreds of years. There was no one there was no migration of people to Rhoda. There was not a lot of people that settled and stayed in Rhoda. So Rhoda and the Chamorros from Rhoda were never, as far as we can tell, forcibly moved from anywhere else. So that's why it's so interesting that even for the women who are okay, so in the Frewan Pobre manuscript, it does mention one woman's name, Sosambra. And And in fact, Angel Santos named one of his daughters Sasambra because it's sort of like the earliest. Now, Sasambra doesn't actually sound very Chamorro, just to be very clear. It was a half Spanish, half Chamorro child. And so, and then now, when I say that they don't really know their names, we do know some of their names, but we know their baptized names. So that's why, for example, some people argue, well, we do know their names, Maria. So that's that's beside the point. They didn't. But then again, many of so the priests would always give the Christian names when they would mention the quote unquote good Chamorros, because they would get them and they would use them, right? So Antonio Ayihi, Alonso Suun, Antonio Enoch, Ignacio Hinetti. But for those who were rebels, they wouldn't, even if they had like a baptism name, a Christian name, they wouldn't use it necessarily. So Sasambra, that's one of them. Hold on, there was another one that I found recently. Wait, let me Mominasalia. What is that? That sounds funny. But anyways, I'm trying to find where it's mentioned. Mominasaria. So I found it in a list. And so I'm not exactly sure where it comes from though, but it was put down. Because I mean, if you want more guy names, there's quite a few. Like Bazogu, Chaifi, Fatahuno, Guihan, Hakman. A lot of them had names for things, right? Guihan, name a guy Guihan. Fish, Hakman, eel, Taga, chop, Toka, to get caught, Hula, tongue, Matapang, clean. Oh, expensive zone. All right. Oh, why is it so? Oh, because the Spanish didn't have any boats or ships. And so so the Spanish there would be one boat, which was the supply ship, like a supply ship that would land, just about every year. And it would bring like money to pay wages to people there. It would bring some supplies, some food. It might take people away and bring in new recruits or replacements. And so the Spanish didn't have any boat that stayed in Guam. Now, they may have had like a rowboat, but you couldn't use a rowboat to go to Rota. And so Chamorros could get to Rota, but the channel can sometimes be very active and very risky. And so it's only best to go sometimes of the year. And so it was only really when Chamorros, like a large number of Chamorros, started to be faithful to the Spanish, that then the Spanish could rely on Chamorros to take them in their canoes. Because if you remember the story of Chelef, would you want to get into a canoe with some random Chamorro naked dude? Hey, you know Chelef? Oh yeah, that's my cousin. No, abort. And so, yeah. So once they had people that were very down for the new religion that they could trust, that's when they started. That's when and eventually that's why the Chamorro-Spanish Wars are not really ended by Spanish forces, but they're ended by the Allies. They're ended by the Allies because when Quiroga goes north to suppress the northern islands, the Gani Islands and Saipan, Tinian, and Rota, he's in a fleet of canoes with Chamorro warriors from Guam who are ready to put down their brothers and sisters to the north in the name of the new religion. And so there could have been, in terms of two-spirit or third gender or anything like that, there could have been. But there's nothing necessarily Yeah, there's nothing really specific. As in going to Spain, Mexico, the PI. So yeah, so the first and most famous example. So Chamorros did get taken, like Liam Neeson style taken. They got like taken against their will for generations, because Chamorros would get kidnapped and then served as slaves in Spanish ships. We don't know what happened to any of them. If some of them may have made it back, we have no idea. But the first recorded and documented journey of Chamorros that we have leaving via the Spanish and coming home, we know their names: Matthias, Pedro, and Ignacio. Pedro Guidan, Matthias Ye, Ignacio Ossi. And so we know their names because these were the boys. They came from Christian Chamorro families in Hagåtña, and this was like 1671, I think June of 1671, when Salvatore picks these three boys as being the most faithful and dedicated of the new converts to the religion, and he chooses them to go to the Philippines to learn with priests there, and hopefully maybe they get to become priests and come back and serve their own people. And so what we know about these guys comes from, if you read The Life and Martyrdom of Salvatore, so they are mentioned in different accounts. These were like Salvatore's boys. This was his attempt at sort of marketing the new religion and sort of bringing and planting the seeds in the next generation. So what we know about these guys is it's hagiographical. It's written from a religious perspective. So it says stuff like they loved God so much that they prayed until their knees bled, that they always wanted to pray and they never wanted to stop praying. It says stuff like that. Oh yeah, shoot, I gotta go soon. And so yeah, if you're on Facebook, my Senator Kelly Marsh Taitano, she's got a conversation with a eco company in Yap, where they use banana leaves and betel nut trees to make paper products for people in Yap, so that they can reduce the importation of styrofoam and create jobs. And so anyways, at 12:30 we're having a conversation with one of the founders of that. But so Salvatore talked up these three that they were going to be the future. That and when they left, there was some grumbling. There had been some instances of violence, but there was no outright warfare. They were away from Guam for a long time, more than a year. And by the time they came back, Salvatore was dead, and the villages were burning churches, and no one remembered who they were. Poor guys. So we don't know what happened to them after they... Actually, we might know. I just may not have seen the account yet. So it is possible, because they are mentioned randomly in different letters from priests at that time, but I don't recall seeing another mention about what happens to them afterwards. But Sidus Masi, Nutodo Samzo, we are 2 out of 10 down. And so if you want to, you can try to guess who we'll be talking about next week for the third one, because we're going to move a little bit more ahead in Chamorro history. But I'm excited. Thank you for listening. Sidus Masi, put in Ekungokzo. And so remember these stories. And interestingly enough, I'm thinking about, so wait, hold on. The eloquent in his barbarity, that image that I shared with you, like years ago, the Guam bus, we made that as like stickers. And then we don't have any more. In fact, I wish I had one of those. But yeah, we're thinking about, I'm thinking about reprinting some, because I love that eloquent in his barbarity. But yeah, so if you follow the Guam bus, if I put out a post asking people if they'd be interested in it, comment and say that you are. All right. Sidus Masi. Adios.
Sidus Masi, señor.
All right.
Adios.